Welcome to the 22nd Annual John W. Hall Lecture in Japanese Studies. My name is Hwan-Soo Kim, Chair of the Council in East Asian Studies. Last year, due to the pandemic, we had to postpone this event. And it seems like we may be at the tail end of this pandemic, and I'm extremely delighted that we are able to host this event in person today. For those of you who are not familiar with this lecture series, I'd like to say a few words about its background. The John W. Hall Lecture Series in Japanese Studies was established with generous support from Mrs. Robin Hall in memory of her husband. Considered one of this past century's finest scholars of the history of Japan, John Whitney Hall was born in Tokyo in 1916 and developed an interest in Japanese language, culture, and history at an early age. After receiving his PhD in East Asian languages and literatures at Harvard, Hall began his academic career at the University of Michigan in 1949 and came to Yale in 1961 as a Whitney Griswold Professor of History, a position he held until his retirement in 1983. Professor Hall specialized in the Ashikawa through late Tokugawa periods, and throughout his career, he wrote or edited some of the most important and influential volumes on Japanese history. He contributed to the study of Japan through not only his writing, but also through service as chair of several local and national committees. Now, I'd like to give the podium over to Professor Daniel Bozeman for introducing the speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. It truly is a delight to be in person with you all, and it is such an honor to be able to introduce and welcome back to Yale Professor Noriko Mizuta, a scholar who throughout her career has given so much to the fields of comparative literature, Japanese studies, and women's studies, and whom in so many ways personifies the best possibilities of the new forms of intellectual exchange and transnational scholarship that were developed between Japan and the US in the second half of the 20th century. Before saying more about Professor Mizuta's remarkable career and scholarship, I hope she'll forgive me if I pause just briefly to say a few words about several other special guests who we have here with us today because of her. So first, we're so grateful to be able to welcome two of Professor Mizuta's 5 children. Professor Akira Lippert, would you mind standing up? Is a leading scholar of cinema and media studies at the University of Southern California, which I'm sure you know has a pretty good media studies and cinema program. He is also vice dean of the faculty in the School of Cinematic Arts there, and he's written about everything from Electric Animals to Jacques Derrida and David Lynch, one of my favorites. And he's currently working on a book about Japanese cinema, which I'm sure we will all learn a great deal from. Professor Yukio Lippert is one of the world's leading scholars of Japanese art history. At Harvard University, like his big brother, Kyo and I were in graduate school together, so I feel like it's okay to use the familiar, I hope. But Kyo's work, too, is extremely wide-ranging, but I will note in particular that his book on the Kano School of painters from the early Tokugawa period in fact won the John Whitney Hall Prize for the best book in Japanese studies in the year that it was published, and that was, of course, awarded by the Association for Asian Studies, so another John Whitney Hall connection there. We're also deeply honored to be joined by Melissa McCormack, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Japanese Art and Culture at Harvard, who many of you will know through her brilliant work on the interplay of history, text, and image in medieval Japanese scrolls, and on the various forms of artistic production associated with the tale of Genji, and whose studies of female readers, writers, and artists, I think, very much speak to questions close to Professor Mizuta's heart. Finally, I want to express my deep, deep gratitude to Professor Alyssa Friedman, who's up in the back, who is Professor of Japanese Literature, Cultural Studies, and Gender at the University of Oregon. Many of you, including the students in the Tokyo seminar that I'm co-teaching this semester with Dr. Michael Thornton, already know what an important scholar Professor Friedman is from her wonderful books, including Tokyo in Transit and most recently Japan on American TV. But she's also editor-in-chief of the US-Japan Women's Journal, which Professor Mizuta played a central role in helping to found in the 1980s. And a few years ago, when I mentioned to Professor Friedman that I was teaching an undergraduate seminar about Yale and Japan, she asked me if I knew about Mizuta Sensei's 2004 book, Joseigaku to no Deai, Encountering Women's Studies, which included an account of her experiences as a graduate student at Yale in the 1960s. I'm afraid to say that I had not known about that book prior to that conversation, but I was so delighted to learn about it. And I mentioned to Dr. Botal, who had recently completed his PhD in history here, that this wonderful book existed, and it would be so nice to have a section of it in English to be able to assign to Yale students. And he said, well, I'll translate it. And so with Professor Friedman's support and encouragement, he was able to publish it appropriately, I think, in the US-Japan Women's Journal. And those of you who've had a chance to read that translation, or perhaps the original, or perhaps Professor Friedman's fascinating biocritical essay in the 2018 special issue of the Review of Japanese Culture and Society that was dedicated to Professor Mizuta's achievements, will know that she came to Yale from Japan as a Fulbright scholar in 1961. She was one of the first group of students to actually fly across the Pacific to come to the United States. And that 1961, of course, was the same year that John W. Hall moved here from the University of Michigan. So there's a nice connection there too, I think. A graduate of Tokyo Women's Christian University, Tokyo Joshi Daigaku, Mizuta Sensei's original plan at Yale was to focus her studies on William Faulkner. But her advisor here suggested that perhaps she should think about a different topic. And she ended up writing her doctoral dissertation about Edgar Allan Poe. I actually went today to Manuscripts and Archives to try and retrieve a copy so I could hold it up and embarrass you, but they wouldn't let me take it out of the library, so I'm sorry. But it is here in the library. And she later published a book based on that dissertation in Japanese under the title of Edgar Allan Poe no Sekai, Tsumi to Yume. After completing her studies at Yale in 1970, Professor Mizuta was hired as an assistant professor of American literature at Marymount College in New York, which is now part of Fordham University, and I think that's a pretty amazing thing in itself, that someone who had arrived from Japan just a few years earlier was appointed as a professor of American literature at an American university. She, after several years there, moved to take up positions at Scripps College and eventually the University of Southern California. During this period, she also became increasingly conscious of the ways in which gender, nation, and race continued to structure and limit the study of literature in the United States, and she set about trying to change that. Particularly after her move to California, she became centrally involved in the establishment of women's studies programs that would help address the exclusion of women from mainstream academic research. And she also would later play an important role in the establishment of women's studies programs in Japan, and was involved, among other things, in the creation of the pioneering journal Feministo. She also, in the workplace, became involved in efforts to advocate for basic rights for female academics, drawing attention to the many disadvantages and problems they continued to face in the US Academy. And with her friend and fellow Yale PhD, Kyoko Selden, she also began translating the work of Japanese women writers, which had previously been largely inaccessible to English language audiences. This collaboration with Kyoko Selden would eventually lead to multiple volumes of translated work, which have now served as an incredibly rich source of inspiration for multiple generations of students. My personal favorite is still Professor Mizuta's translation of Oba Minako's Smile of a Mountain Witch from the original collection, which was published in 1982, but I suspect many of you will have others that have remained in your memories. Through all of this, of course, Professor Mizuta also continued to produce her own scholarship, including her 1982 book, Reality and Fiction in Modern Japanese Literature, which begins with a discussion of the pre-war I novels, and then after exploring the work of Akutagawa, Tanizaki, Poe, and Mishima, it concludes by showing how Tomioka Taeko's work really served to transcend the limitations of the pre-war I novel, in large part because she was able to draw on aspects of her own experience as a woman and as a woman writer. Like John W. Hall, she has also had a remarkable career as an institution builder. In the middle of the 1980s, she returned to Japan to become Vice Chancellor of the Josai University Educational Corporation and threw herself into the work of establishing the Josai International University, which she became president of in 1996. Again, as part of her efforts to build this dynamic new institution, she created opportunities for female scholars and leaders, and although her own development as a scholar was something that emerged in the context of post-war US-Japan relations, she has since built on that foundation to establish truly global connections, both throughout Asia and to Europe. Even as she has held these important and demanding positions, she has also continued to publish volumes of her own poetry and literary criticism in Japanese on writers including Sylvia Plath, Doris Lessing, Oba Minako, Tsushima Yuko, and Tomioka Taeko, among others, and on topics including feminism, patriarchy, and the family. In all of these ways, and many others that I have to omit today, Professor Mizuta offers us a model for how to build a truly generative scholarly career that opens new intellectual worlds while also creating opportunities for others. With regard to Japanese women writers in particular, I would like to believe that the recent attention that authors including Sayaka Murata Sayaka, Kawakami Miyako, and Yu Miri, among others, have garnered around the world suggests that maybe the world is finally catching up with Professor Mizuta decades later. She has certainly been recognized with numerous prizes and honors from institutions around the world for her achievements. And again, we are so grateful to have her back here at Yale. Her lecture today is titled Women Writers and the Discourse of the Post-War in Japan. Please join with me in welcoming Professor Mizuta.
Thank you very much, Dr. Botsman, for your very kind introduction and also ultra kind introduction to my sons. Thank you very much. I am very honored and grateful to be invited to deliver a lecture at the John Hall Lecture at Yale University before so many distinguished scholars of Japanese studies and in other fields. It is truly a joy to have an opportunity to come back to this campus. As Dr. Botsman mentioned very kindly, that as a graduate student at Yale University, I lived in New Haven from 1961 to 1966. And my stay at Yale University had a very important meaning for my life because it marked nothing but the beginning of my second life as a scholarly career. But also I married here and gave birth to my first son, Aki, who is here in New Haven. So it was the start of my family life. And my experiences as a woman, being married and having children and then rearing children, started in New Haven here. Also, the time I came here in 1961 was the time when, and then until 1966, is the time when United States went through a very radical changes in society and in culture. I will never forget one day coming out of my class and quitting the Hall of Graduate Studies and walking on the street, and on the television, I heard the announcement of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And the assassination of the president underscores the tension that was really becoming very acute in the world. And Cuba had undergone a very successful revolution, but suddenly Cuba was thrust into the midst of the tension of the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union. So the threat of the nuclear war was felt very palpable. During that time, particularly 1961, was the time of the beginning of the civil rights movement. And of course, it grew during the 1960s and then into 70s, but 1961 was really the start when students and then people started being involved in the movement. And particularly Yale Law School students were on the forefront of that movement. I remember very clearly in 1964, my husband and my infant son, we joined the march to Washington in 1964 to hear the Reverend Martin Luther King speak. And I was very much thrilled that the historical changes is taking place before us. And that period also was the very dynamic and then active cultural changes in the United States. And in Greenwich Village, we could hear beatniks read poetry, and off-Broadway theater was very active, introducing to American audience many very radical works, such as The Blacks, and then Marasad by Assad. And also the music, free jazz, and so forth, gave me a feel that really the dynamism of cultural changes and then also the sense of freedom that is really taking place in the United States. I remember being very moved seeing John Baez singing barefoot in the nightclub, and that was really a wonderful time. One of the events that I will not forget that I experienced during my stay in Yale was that one of my very close friends, Tomioka Taeko, who was introduced by Dr. Botsman just now, came to Yale to do her readings. And I organized the reading because I knew her well in Japan, and also her poems were translated and then had a very, not a very large, but a good audience in English-speaking people. And the person who came with her as a translator was Kate Millett. And you all know Kate Millett's work, Sexual Politics, which now is considered the classic of the feminist literature. But at that time, she was a professor of English literature at Barnard. And it was before she transformed herself into a very radical feminist. So it was a very interesting event for me, knowing Kate Millett as a person who was really being engaged in writing that voluminous book on the feminist criticism of English literature. Now, And I came to Yale University in order to study William Faulkner because at the time, the Yale University had so many brilliant group of scholars, and I was very much excited to meet and take courses of wonderful professors, including Sivan Woodward and Robert Penn Warren, and then W.H. Auden, and then John Hollander, and among others. And I went to consult Professor Clarence Brooks about writing dissertation on Faulkner, but Dr. Clarence Brooks mentions that he just wrote an authoritative book on William Faulkner, and there's nothing left for me to say, nor any scholars to say about Faulkner. And instead, he suggested that I do research on Edgar Allan Poe because he was very much underestimated at the time in 1961. No new books were written on Poe. And I was very, very grateful for his suggestions because it was really the start of my research, scholarly research on Edgar Allan Poe, who has a tremendous influence on Japanese literature through Baudelaire and so forth, the French symbolist. And also, this was the first encounter of a real prototype of outcast in literature. And then this theme of outcast, and in Japanese, haguremono, we call it, has remained one of the central themes of literary research. Now, coming out of Japan, being born in 1930s, and myself went through the period of Sino-Japanese and Pacific War when I was a child. The war was over when I was third grade in the elementary school. And I went through my junior high days after the war, during the occupations. And that was the time Japan suffered from the lack of food and even the starvation went through, and Japan was under the occupation of the Allied, United Allied Army based in Tokyo. And then Yale-dollar ratio was fixed in order to support Japan's economic development. So it was $360 per yen, and Japanese could take only $200 a year. So it was really a tremendous experience as a young woman to be out of Japan, which was really confined in its own territory and its own thinking, to come to Yale and see many, the young people who really enjoy freedom of activities and in thought in those days. But at the time I came, Yale was attended exclusively by men. So sure enough, I did not see any female student on campus. But, and also in graduate seminars, the women formed the minority for sure. But in Helen Hadley Hall, which was at that time, was assigned as the graduate of women's dormitory, there are so many foreign women, young scholars from all over the world. And then global community was formed there. And it was the first time for me to meet Korean women or Chinese women who are from the neighboring countries, but we Japanese didn't have any chance to be in contact with the people from the world. And I do remember very clearly those days that the United States was inviting many young scholars to its own country with a very generous scholarships, and also urged young people to go abroad and to see the world for example, as a part of the Peace Corps group. So it was really the start of the globalization of education, of thinking, and then the personal exchanges. And that was really a wonderful time, and I was very grateful that I had an opportunity to study at Yale University in those days. Now, I would like to move on to the theme of my talk today. That is about sengoron. It means the post-war discourse and post-war Japan discourse. And well, since the start of the end of the war in 1945 on, Japanese had been debating and then furiously even fighting in the understanding of the post-war Japan in many terms, in political and social and then cultural terms. And that really occupied the field of philosophy and thinking and then criticism in Japan, and then still now it goes on. And many people think that the post-war period of Japan has not ended and still will not be over in the foreseeable near future. And simply because we now in 2022 face a very serious challenge from the neighboring countries in Asia, from Korea, from China, and then East Asian countries, Southeastern countries, which were colonized or invaded by Japan, and particularly the question of forced laborers and the comfort women are the very, very hot and then serious issues right now in 2022, after almost 80 years of the end of the war. And also the question of the existence of the American Army base in Okinawa, as you know, causes so much also the problems and also the debate among Japanese people, which divided the thinking of Japanese. And then the election is coming this June in the upper house of Japanese Diet. And the hottest issue, most important issue, is the change of the constitution, which many Japanese think that it was imposed by the United States. And it was not the choice, the own choice of Japanese people to have this constitution, which assures the peace, a peaceful nation, and also the gender equality for women. So even though many years have passed, we still debate that those problems which are caused by the Second World War, and probably much goes back much before, are not solved. Unless we face these problems and come up with a very reasonable solutions, then young people cannot go ahead to think of the future as a member of the Japan as a national entity. So the post-war period can be considered in different ways. One of the ways to refer to this the period is since 1945 that Japan surrendered to the Western countries, and to 1952 when the Allied occupation was over. That is certainly the very immediate sense, the concrete sense, the post-war period. But most of us, as I have mentioned just now, I think that the post-war continues to go on in 1960s when Japan experienced a very dizzying, rapid economic development with some environmental problems caused by this economic development. And also into 1970s when yen started floating and the foreign exchange rate became the subject of competition in the market of the foreign exchange. And Japan became economically independent in the sense that, that this protected rate of exchange is now thrown away. And then oil shock came, and then after that, Japan experienced this bubble economic development in 1980s. And then in 1990s, we had a very shocking event caused by Shindikyo, this sudden attack on the people of Japan in subway. And these many critics and then thinkers in Japan consider that those incidents mark the end of the post-war period. But nevertheless, from the start of the 21st century, those problems are not, the problems caused by the invasion of Japan and the colonization of the countries around Japan were not solved. And as I mentioned, that the comfort women problems are really important issues that we cannot just ignore and forget about it and then go on living in the modern period. And also this question of atomic bomb and then radiations and then the damage that it gives to human body and so forth has never been really faced directly as a problem of Japan and also as a problem of the United States, I think, which justified its use to end the war and then to say a very control of the world with the democratic thinkings. So I agree with these critics who really think it's important for us to solve these problems in order to end the post-war discursive conditions in Japan. Let me just summarize the points of the post-war discourse that were developed in these 80 years, almost 80 years in the post-World War. One is the question of the responsibility and the paying of the reparation to those nations which are colonized and to those people who are victimized during the war. And many people think it has not been done properly. And still there are so many people who are left and then who are very silent about this being victimized by the war. And of course that comfort women and then forced labor is really at the core of the issue. And the second point of the discourse of the post-war Japan is the insistence of the particularity of Japanese as Japanese people and also the mentality, the cultural tradition of Japan. So the Nihonjinron, as we call it, which we have the book, the very influential book by Nakane Chie, the human relations in vertical society, tate shakai no ningen kanke, and also a book, Anatomy of Dependence, Amae no Kozo by Doi Takeo, and there are the works written by Kawai Hayao, and they really talk about a very uniqueness of Japanese mentality and Japanese culture, which are not so easily destroyed by the occupation of the United States or the defeat of the war. It has a much deep-rooted the basis origins that Japan built up during the long period of its own development. And together with this particularity of Japanese mentality and Japanese culture, people started receiving the kind of criticism of this particularity by, say, the Korean Japanese writers, that the particularities and then a uniqueness are not genuine qualities, but were based on the victimization of the others who do not belong to Japanese culture. And also, the point of this discussion is occupied by so-called nejire gensho. It's the nejire, the twisted phenomenon of a Japanese really mind, and particularly very evident in the post-war period. And the important debate that developed between Yoshimoto Takaaki, Yoshimoto Ryumei, and Mishima Yukio reveal this nejire gensho very clearly, that Yoshimoto thinks that he feels responsible for those who were killed in the war, and as a survivor of this tremendous imperial the regime that led Japan into the war and victimized many young people. And he grew up as a young man, believing in this ideology, and was ready to face his death. I feel very guilty about what he went through as a young man. So he tries to go into the analysis, of a very complete analysis of what led Japan to have this extraordinary act of getting into the Second World War and forced Japan into the competition of the colonial politics of the world. On the other hand, Mishima Yukio, as you all know, are very ashamed of the Japan's defeat. Mishima Yukio was not very much affected by the war itself, but the defeat of the war, the concept of the defeat, somehow, which was very alien to Japanese tradition, and then also as a nation, that destroyed the identity and the pride of Japanese people. Mishima could not take the young generations of Japan who really enjoy economic development and then new freedom that was just forced by the United States to make Japan a perfect ally that will support the America's endeavors in the international society as a nation which does not have the force to defend itself. Another important debate was also developed by Yoshimoto Takaaki and Eto Jun. Probably those who are familiar with Japanese literary criticism will know Eto Jun. He is a very important critic in the field of literary criticism. He was born in 1930s, and then my generation, he's a few years older than I am, but came to the United States and stayed at Yale, actually. I mean, he came to study at Princeton. But I met him at Yale University at the time of the lecture delivered by Donald King. And his point of nejire phenomenon of Japanese mentality stem from two factors. One is the unconditional surrender. This concept of unconditional surrender is also the subject of debate, but he thinks Japan gave up all of its identity to the concept of democracy, and also the concept of the United States, the political endeavor in making of the power areas to support the America. And so Japan was deprived of the force, armies, forever to defend itself and also to depend upon American military power. And the other point is that occupation by the American force and the perfect censorship that controlled the development of post-war Japanese culture and then thinking, that created Japanese mentalities not to speak out very freely against the discuss the political factors, but will go into the very understated and very twisted the argument in talking about the post-war Japanese society and the culture. And he talks about the decline of fatherhood, the power of the father, and then loss of the motherhood, which was considered to be all embracing the power close to nature, and then lacking the subjective desire as a gender. And he comes up with the conclusions that the most important thing for post-war Japan should really regain the pride and identity and the power of fatherhood, which is directly related to the nation itself. And the third point of the post-war discourse it's something to do with what we call cultural topography, that it concerns the memories of the ruins and defeat and the memories of the disaster of the nation that underwent the defeat and changes, not in a very obvious political sense, but say talking about the cultural sites, such as American army base and black market that really appeared in the complete yakeato, the ruins in Tokyo. The 70% of Tokyo was completely destroyed by the air raids. But it concerns with the memories, how Japan will maintain the memory of this defeat and destructions and in the development of Japanese cities and then Japan as a nation. So it goes very deeply into the layers of memories, the memories of disaster in the earthquakes, and then all these things, layer by layer, that the calamities and disaster Japan experienced, and particularly in the post-war period. And the fourth point about the discourse of the post-war of Japan is to place Japan's post-war situation in international and comparative perspectives, particularly the Cold War world. So instead of calling post-war, they will call the Cold War. That is, of course, the overlaps the period of post-war, because the Cold War situation started immediately after the Cold War. And those people who argue the changing, the shifting, the perspectives of talking of the post-war Japan, placing it, resituating it in the world situation of post-colonialism and then post-war. And those arguments were led by Ueno Chizuko, a very well-known feminist. Right now it's very active, and also Takahashi Genichiro and Uchida Tatsuki and Takahashi Tetsuya, the younger generations who did not experience the Second World War as a childhood. Now, most of the critics and thinkers who are involved in post-war Japanese discourse consider that the post-war situations are present at this time. and the Japanese conservative political parties and the many conservative, the right-wing people try to forget about this defeat experiences and what happened in the war, and to build up Japan as a truly independent nation with a military force, and probably empowering Japanese army force and the Japanese nation to cope with the international threat that is really taking place in 2022. And although I agree with those critics that the post-war situation was never be over, but for different reasons. And what is very important is that in all these discourse on post-war Japan, clearly the women's experiences of the post-war, it was that the women themselves went through a tremendous changes caused by the war, has not been discussed at all, almost at all. And also the perspective of gender is absent in most of, or almost all of the critics who talked about and discussed the post-war Japan. And it did not mean that Japanese women did not think during the, all these 8 years, but women did express their own understanding and of the post-war Japan and so forth, but they are really put into a special field of feminist criticism dealing with the women's issue, and were not integrated into the overall the discourse on post-war Japan. They were the women's problems, and the men do not understand their problems because they are not women. So although the very active discussion was taking place in the World War years, they were treated as a special kind of discussions that are relevant only to women, but not for the nation as a whole. So the result is that we still have gender divisions. The Japanese women are very much kept away from taking part in the very political important areas which makes decisions about gender. Comfort women problems are not solved, and so forth. And one other absence of perspective is that although the critics involved in the post-war discourse are very much writers and poets and the scholars of literature and then critics, they did not deal with the works itself in order to see how the world changed, how the consciousness has changed, what are the problems that affected our lives and then mentality after the war, caused by this, the radical change and the defeat and destruction that that Japan met probably for the first time in its history. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Yes. So the purpose here for my lecture is that to examine what women writers thought and discussed and then expressed as their understanding of the post-war experiences, and how this absence of women's writers' work had made the discourse debate on the post-war period made very much male kind of oriented discussions centered around, say, the politics and the nations in the world. And I like to analyze probably 3 poets and 2 novelists here, if I have enough time allowed to discuss them. There are so many women writers, and actually what characterizes the post-war literary phenomena is the rise of women writers, the brilliant writers, and you cannot ignore those, the works of those writers when you discuss and then, analyze the modern Japanese literature. The first, the poet that I like to mention is Morisaki Kaze, who wrote a very influential book in 1963 and was published as a book form in 1965, which is entitled The Third Sex. And that immediately, I think, you are reminded of the Second Sex by Simone Beauvoir, and that is, of course, that marks the start of the post-war feminist thinking in the Western world. The third sex seems to me more advanced than the second sex. Anyhow, she's talking about the division of female sexuality between the categories of women who bear children and who don't bear children. And that is the disparity that was caused by the patriarchal family system about the norm of heterosexual, the relationship of gender. And she develops her ideas into the third possibilities of the choice, that women's sexuality should not be divided into 2 categories, but there is a multiple possibilities for women's sexuality beyond this division of childbirth and then the maternity. And this is a very, very kind of stimulating discussions that took place in 1965. She was born in Korea and repatriated in the post-war Japan. So her experiences of being brought up in Korea, I think, was a very unique aspect of the post-war thinking. And she also dealt with the Karayuki-san, the making of a prostitute, at the very early stage of the discussion of the comfort women. And then I like to mention Shiraishi Kazuko, the poet, who is also born in the so-called outside territory of Japan, Gaichi. But in her case, she was born in Vancouver and came back to Japan just before the end of the war. Although she was very much, I think, read by Japanese audience, and also her works are translated in the United States in English and so forth, she was considered as a black sheep, and then considered as haguremono, outcast, all through her life as a woman, as a poet, and as anything that you can think about. And she was very proactive in approaching American base, which is a new topos that appeared for the first time after the war, and still goes on, and then subject of the discussion. And then she had a very, what I call the taboo subject of having sexual relations with outsiders, as black servicemen and then so forth, and then wrote about the sexual freedom of Japanese women, which somehow undermines the heterosexual normative, the concept of the sexuality of patriarchal family system that pushed, forced the women's sexuality to be in the childbearing, the sexuality, and also motherhood. And she has a very striking poem called Mai Tokyo. That is situated in the post-war period of Japan, that subterranean territory of Tokyo, the subway systems, which really is developed very extensively starting from the end of the war, as the metaphor for female body. And so the outcasts and then revolutionaries and then foreigners go through women's bodies that really controls the most of the territories, the subterranean territories of Tokyo, which has been rebuilt and then modernized very quickly in the post-war areas. And so she kind of deconstructed the motherhood, not as a childbearing sexuality, but also a kind of locale, the place where embraces the death and the life of those who are hurt by the damage caused by the war, and also who do not have the place to live within the system that is established. And also her contemporary Yoshihara Sachiko, also the author of the very important poems of the post-war Japanese modern poetry, and also the translator of Sylvia Plath. She talks of the absence of fatherhood, the God, and the existence which really determines the norms of the human existence and also sexual norms and so forth. But in absence, what she calls a radical evil that takes place. And this concept of radical evil is taken, I think, from the Hannah Arendt concept of Nazism, that there is an absolute evil which causes this destruction and then the violence in the world, but we don't know what it is. It's the kind of chaos that is replaced in the form, in the place which hitherto fatherhood and the national the identity had occupied. And her stories of the poems are very much concentrated on her mother's experiences as a free new woman in 1920s, at the time of the Seito, the very active feminist movement of 1920s through the journal called the Seito Blue Stockings. But those experiences of new women had to face the complete defeat and the failure because of the rise of the imperial power in Japan. And then Yoshihara's mother is one of those women who thought the freedom of female sexuality and then subjectivity through the extramarital sexual relationship, but had the experience of being betrayed by that desire. And in the post-war period of Japan, she was protected by her legal husband, together with the daughter of the extramarital, the relationship, protected by the nuclear family system, which is also the system, the much smaller form of patriarchal family system, but also the system which is based as the foundation of Japanese new economic development after the war, placing Japan and women to a very definite sexual roles as a housewife who is in charge of the reproduction of the labor force and then the life. So Yoshihara Sachiko's experience and then expression of her post-war feeling is how to deal with this tremendous failure of the feminist women who were active and had a hope for female subjectivity in 1920s and have been completely pushed to oblivions and also to oppressions after the war. So she tried to take over the heritage of these new women in the beginning of the 20th century, but at the same time, her a kind of desire to go to transcend the heterosexual relations and also the marriage that created as the basis of the modern Japan. So her works, it's very, very violent in the sense that she talks of the pain and agony that women's body, female body, took as the burden of all the victimizations of the post-war period. But then she talks very positively about the diversity of female sexuality that is completely hidden in the post-war Japan. And the third novelist, the person I like to mention is Oba Minako, who also stayed in Alaska for 12 years. Alaska, above all other places, the remote area of not of the United States but of the earth, where the outcasts, come to live from all over the world. As a wife of the businessman who went to, say, get lumbers and then, they make paper pulps for the development of Japanese economy in the post-war period. But she made a debut, the very shocking debut, as she was called, in 1960s, in 1967 or something, with the work called The Three Clubs. And she has a book which Professor Botsman mentioned in the kind introduction, has a work called The Smiles of the Mountain Witch that analyzes the mentality of housewives that is very much divided into the two aspects. One is that enjoying the protection and then support of the family, and then as a housewife, protected by men's economic power, and enjoys this safety and as an environment to raise children. But at the same time, the Japanese housewives aspire to be a mountain witch. And the mountain witch is Yamamba. It's a very legendary existence in Japanese folklore and then literature that transcends the norms of sexuality. Sometimes she's very violent, she's aggressive, but at the same time, she's free from all the jurisdictions of the communities and then probably the nation, and very free from the sexual norms. This concept of Yamamba was very much developed by other Japanese women writers, such as Tsushima Yuko, talks about as this Yamamba as a prototype of women's independence in the post-war period. But the most important work that appears in 1955 is Urashima So, Oba Minako's novel. The Urashima So is the name of the plant, which is an endangered species, and it actually exists. It's a very gloomy the flower, but you all know the Urashima legend, and that like Rip Van Winkle in Western counterpart, Urashima spent a few years in the undersea, the paradise, and then coming back to his homeland, he discovers that the homeland was changed almost completely. There are no traces of former community and existences in that the country itself disappeared. So he opens up the tamatebako, a jewelry box, which was given by the queen of that underworld. He opens up the tamatebako, and the smoke comes out, and it just let all his memories of the homeland and the past life go away and then disappear. The story of Urashima So is a story about a young woman, Japanese woman, who came back from the United States after her studies in the United States, together with her boyfriend who was thinking of marriage in Japan. And she comes to live with her half-brother, whose name is Morito, and the mountain man, in a house which is in the periphery of Tokyo, together with his lover, who has a child who is autistic and mute without a speech, and Ryoko, his lover's husband, who just came back from the war front. And then this Morito has an adopted daughter who is born probably of the American father, and who takes care of this mute autistic child. So it's a very strange community. It exists in form of one family. The lover and her husband, and then the child who was born out of Hiroshima experiences. Ryoko went to Hiroshima soon after the war, and there he met Morito, her lover, and had a child. So the child becomes a symbol of the atomic weapon and then effect of the radiation on not only the human body, but at the same time the Japanese society in general. So it's a very strange family, the community, that symbolizes the effect of the atomic bomb. And Oba Minako's point is that we cannot think of going back to the pre-atomic weapon age, or nor the culture or the country. The atomic bomb experience is so definite and so serious that it changes completely, not just the community tradition, but also the Japanese mentality, psychology, but also the entire world, that we have to really face the effect of the atomic bomb, its damages it gives to not only human bodies, but the entire life of the earth. At the end of the story, it's that this Yukie, young man who studied in the United States, decides not to get married to an American young man, and goes back to the United States as an independent woman to continue her study in the United States. And Yukie, the adopted daughter who takes care of the mute child, decides to have a baby with that child, who was really a kind of symbolic existence of the effect of the atomic weapon. And thus, Oba says that we should really kind of accept the heritage of atomic damage and sufferings by having a baby from that mute child. But at the same time, that we have to face the irreversible conditions that atomic bomb created on everything on the earth. So she goes back to the United States, accepting probably the presence of America in the post-war Japan and in the post-war world as an independent woman. So accept this Nejire Gensho as it is. And then the future of Japan, the future of the world is placed on the new child who will be born out of this autistic, mute child. And then Oba asks the questions. What about the Urashima legend that the smoke comes out as an atomic, smokes and the tremendous, the mushroom cloud that covers up the whole world, and then it's post-war Japan going to be completely erased as the important existence in the post-war the world. And Japan is going to forget its these agonizing experiences just by demilitarizing the nations and to have probably atomic weapon in the future. Then what about these experiences of the humankind, of having this invented, this terrible, destructive weapon? And now the world is getting into the conflict among nations who try to develop its power, the political military power, by creating more advanced the nuclear weapons. So she kind of parallels the experience of the atomic bomb, that it is so decisive in determining the human mentality, human culture, through female experiences of having her body affected and having the children affected and so forth. But world is going to forget, as if it is covered by the smoke, which came out of the tamatebako jewelry box and into the oblivions. So it's the most, I think, strong the questions that are put to the people of the post-war world, not just Japan, but the countries which really forget about the tragedies of the use of the atomic weapons, but they are really very serious about strengthening these terrible weapons in order to fortify their power, the military powers, in the 21st centuries. So I'd like to end my discussion of this discourse on the post-war by talking about Tomioka Taeko, who is, again, one of the very important writers, who criticized the middle class, the family, and particularly women and men who enjoyed the very much so-called middle class development, together with the technological development and then economic power that really created the Japanese, the modern Japanese state and the economic affluence in the post-war period. And she talks about this outcast of this modern society itself, together with this the concept of mountain witches and then so forth, who will not have the subjectivity presented in the post-war period, so far as Japan will not face this sexual discrimination, the violence, and then gender divisions, which are covered up so much by willfully by the government and then also by people who just don't want to face this phenomena. And also, so far as Japan and the world come up to face with the risk, the tremendous risk that atomic weapon and the use of the radiation, that means electric power plant and power, the reactor that, of course, is very dangerous to the human life, not only the human life, to the environment, that 3.11 of the of Fukushima showed to us very clearly. So these are the questions have not been faced not only by Japan, post-war Japan, but by the world at large, that no one had really learned the experiences of the damage and destruction that were caused by the use of these nuclear weapons. So the discussions about the post-war Japan, Japanese experiences of getting away from the imperial, very the controlling power of the nation into the democratic nation, so-called. But this democracy is not really a democracy which gives the benefit, peace, and then coexistence among those competing nations, particularly the nations which compete with the fortification of the brutal, the destructive powers. So Oba Minako, who have died some years ago, but still this Urashimaso remains as one of the representative novel that the post-war, both political and also the cultural situations that the world must have faced very clearly, but avoided to come to talk about this, to think about this. Now, finally, I'd like to talk about dear friends of mine who shared my own experiences of staying in the United States at Yale in 1960s. They are Karatani Kojin, a very, right now very influential, the critic and the philosopher, and his deceased wife, the novelist Meio Masako. The Meio Masako wrote that a very feminist, very attractive novel called A Glimpse of a Woman, Aru Onna no Glimpse, which is based on Arishima Takeo's Aru Onna, the story of a woman who tries to search for the subjectivity, the freedom of women, the sexual freedom, coming to the United States, and that was written before the war. And so Meio Masako, staying at New Haven, at Yale, together with her husband, came to rethink of this female kind of imagination and then search into real freedom in the democratic societies. And again, coming to the United States, just as the heroines of the Aru Onna no Glimpse by Arishima Takeo came to the United States in search of it and fails in the United States in her search. And then Meio Masako has the same experiences and has this version of Aru Onna no Glimpse. If you are interested in that was, I'd like you to read that work, which came out of her experiences at Yale University. And then Karatani Kojin, his latest works are very much common in his ideas of criticizing the state nations that emerged after imperial nations, the modern state, nation state. Is the betrayal of the hope for the future in the post-war world. And he presents the prototype of mountain man, which is the counterpart of mountain witches who live outside of this jurisdiction of the community, the very strong community. Probably it's linked very directly to the nationalism of the nation state. And then he envisions the community which is free from the political control and the power, the community which is created by free exchange and then distribution of the wealth. So I think right now somehow mountain man and mountain witches came to meet together in a new, probably development of the post-war Japanese discourse. And remembering these friends who really shared the experiences of staying at Yale in 1960s, which seemed to be very far away, but at the same time, the experiences still, I think, lingers, not the facing the problems caused by the Second World War. I feel very happy to be back and then to have been given this opportunity to come back to Yale campus. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Microphones for the audience, which we can run out. So however you'd like to call the questions.
Yes. Yes, yes, please. Those.
The floor is open to questions or comments.
Thank you very much for your extraordinary lecture. I'm Edward Kamens. We met many years ago when you interviewed me for a job which I didn't get. So, a young fellow named Shirane got that job, I believe.
Yes,
but it's such an honor to have you return to our campus. I was so fascinated by your discussion of the cultural topography of defeat.
Yes.
The yakeato, the burned out city, the remnants of the black markets, and the military installations. Could you tell us if any of the writers that you spoke about or others have had a special relationship or made special use of that topography in scenes represented in their poetry or their novels or short stories?
Yes. Thank you very much for your question. I think that if we talk about the critics of this cultural topography, the first person who came to my mind is Isoda Koichi, who looked at the post-war, the topography, I mean the scenery of Tokyo, which was completely destroyed and changed. The reconstruction of the city, unlike, say, that of Germany and Poland and so forth, try to rebuild the same kind of buildings, same kind of communities, same the plaza and so forth. Japan just forgot about the post-war structures and then built up a new, the buildings, high-rise buildings, and then so forth. They tried to create a new city sceneries. But the question of memories, that topography and then scenery are very much related to the memories. Once the scenery changes, we also forget about the memories and then things, the lives and the culture that existed in the former scenery just disappear. So, but like in Kyoto, you see that there are layers of these conflicts among the families, and then all these complicated memories are, accumulated. And so the critics such as Maeda and then also Isoda Koichi try to deal with the memories. The very important, I think, they are the concept of our human experiences in the history that we tend to forget but don't forget. And that creates most the psychological, again, the twist in the development of the new world. But if you look at the works, literary works, that you can find lots of them as an important topics in Sakaguchi Ango, and then all these, Dazai Osamu too, who experienced this, the radical destructions. And I myself, was born and lived in Japan as a childhood, but I can't find any remnant of my childhood life after the war, because the destruction was so complete. And so the air raids just, let everything disappear in one night. So, but the memory lingers, and what is very important is the memories, how we keep the memories, how we make a new hope and then development out of digesting these memories and not forgetting about it. And I think Isoda Koichi's work was very influential. I think that was written in late 1960s, in the early period. And this yake, black market, also is a very interesting topic, I think. It developed into the golden eye of Shinjuku, and all these special, this the sections of izakaya and so forth came out of the black market areas. And also it's the area where foreigners, people who came back from the colonial Korea and so forth, came there and then had their own business that developed into the big business of pachinko and then others and in the development of the economic prosperity in Japan. So it is a very new but refreshing way of talking about the post-war phenomena and the culture, not just always talking about the political issues of the government, criticizing how the government had a long policy and so forth, but look at the topos that where we built our post-war life. And
Thank you very much, Chloe Starr. Do you think your women writers' reformulations of female sexuality had any effect on male writers or men more generally in their understanding of women's sexuality in the period following the writing?
right now in Japan,
in the decade or two following, the rethinking on women as not necessarily just childbearing, for example.
I see, yes. In the post-war period in Japan, it is very peculiar, I think, abnormal in the sense that this discussion about the society and the history are completely limited to male thinkers and critics, that putting all the experiences of women and also what women thought and expressed into a big parenthesis, that it is women's issues, and then it's the discuss on feminist criticism and analysis. And that did not exist, I think, in the world. Like since 1960s in France has been dealing with these feminist issues and then the sexual norms and then so forth, very much into the discussion, integrated part of the thinking of the new world. But Japan somehow completely ignored. And I think it is a question of the criticism, the critics in Japan, that they really thought they can get away with facing these issues and then questions. And I think it would have been very different. And also, but talking about female expressions, representations too, I think we have different images of post-war period. And I think we could have imagined differently much earlier if we talked about the female experiences, how they accepted and tried to transcend this really very agonizing experience of new women, the phenomena of Saito in the pre-war period, and how the human body, female body, was controlled by the political, the policies during the war and so forth. We should have discussed much earlier and faced those questions, I think. Yes.
I had two questions. One is really a clarification. I wondered, so am I correct in thinking that you were presenting Oba Minako's Urashima So as a critique of the Eto-jun position on Nejiri Gensho? So rather than trying to fix the Nejiri Gensho, we should accept it and see what comes out of that? Is that the correct way to think about it?
Very much the post-war discourse, it's based on how to accept the United States, its policies, and then in forming democratic nations with this peace constitution and so forth. It's divided in a radical way that probably right-wing people reject dependency on the United States and America. And then others think that despite the fact that we did experience in the occupation areas, which was very much controlled by the censorship, nevertheless, it was a good thing for Japan that it came out of this military-controlled imperial the power into new possibilities of the democratic development. It's very much divided. But when you look at the phenomenon through the women's perspective, the things look very different. I mean, the existence of America became, symbolically, not just the outsiders or insiders, but it became very complicated part of the post-war Japan development. And it's also bisexual, too, in a way that Oba Minako presents that the boy who was born is taken care of by a daughter who was born of American, probably the soldiers or whatever, and then as a symbol of the atomic bomb damage. But this has to be really accepted, and then to have a new baby out of this, the symbol of the atomic weapon, that's the only start of our overcoming the Nejire post-war phenomenon. So she's positive, at the same time very critical, and rejecting this the discourse developed by male critics, I think, in general.
Thank you. The second question, if I may, is, so you spoke a lot about the need to overcome the question of atomic war and atomic weapons, and I wondered, not to speak on behalf of people who are younger, but my sense today is that the question of climate change and the Anthropocene has somehow dwarfed the question of nuclear war. So the nuclear question has now become one that is a kind of subset of this bigger problem, both of which basically spell the possibility of the end of the world as we know it. But I wonder how you think about that problem and those two things in relation to each other, particularly given that whereas Japan has had the unique experience of being bombed by atomic weapons, the question of climate change and this bigger question of the destruction of the world is one that really is universal in a very different way. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about those.
Well, I think that my experiences in the United States in 1960s is that I was really struck by the fact most of the Americans justifies the use of the atomic bomb, that it is a method to end the war and also even to save Japanese from a mass extermination or the murder. And it was unbelievable for those who witnessed the real damage of the nuclear weapon. It's really very brutal and unbelievably the unbelievable agony was put to human beings. And also it's very much related to the birth of the children. We know the effect of the radioactivities. It's very serious for our fertility and sterility and so on and so forth. And it also stays on in the earth, in the water, and circulates to damage the earth. It is one of the most serious experiences we had during the war, I think. But look at the world right now. No one is seriously discussing the control of the atomic weapon and so forth. But I think from the environmental standpoint of view, I think younger generation will come to understand that if you use the nuclear power, you will have to deal with the tremendous waste, and it's a garbage that not only the Earth but the universe has to deal with, and it is such a most uneconomical and futuristic attempt to use the electricity for the immediate purpose of development. People say we need it, the electricity. It's very essential, but to use even the nuclear reactor, and then of course we face the danger of Ukrainian, the conflict. Even though the nuclear reactor is not used, still it is bombed. Then all the radioactivities will come out and then damage the earth almost permanently. And that is a kind of the heritage that the Second World War left to us, and we have to face it, I think. I very strongly believe that this kind of waste that the human development of or happiness or whatever, the convenience and so forth, it's really the boomerang that will come back to us, and then we have to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any final questions? No, I hope you'll join with me in thanking Professor Mizuta for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you very much. Very nice of you. Thank you. Thank you.